Morning, folks. I've been telling a bunch of my stories about adventures in the Rocky Mountains, but I wanted to tell some stories about some characters I met over the years. Most of these old guys have crossed over the divide and are gone now, and it'd just be a shame to not get these stories recorded. This story is about a blood Indian I met that grew up packing horses and mules in Canada, and he was a one-armed man when I met him. He'd been mauled by a grizzly, but he got telling me some of his stories when he was still a big, strong man with two arms, and I wanted to pass some of them along. So pull up a chair and I'll tell you the story about Billy Takes the Gun. This story about a blood Indian out of Canada. He was a one-armed man I met many years ago in Montana, and he was in his late 70s when I met him, and I thought he was a burn victim. He was missing an arm and a leg, and an ear melted down his neck, and I was asking him how to catch walleye fish. And once we got to know each other pretty well, he finally told me the story of what had happened. And he'd had his arm tore off by a grizzly bear, a wounded bear that he was tracking. But anyhow, before all that, we'll get to that story later. Before that happened, he was a young man, a teenager, and him and his brother guided stone sheep hunts up in northern British Columbia. Now, in those days, there wasn't bush planes and all this fancy gear they got now. Just to get into that sheep country in those days would take 14, 15, so maybe 17 days of hard riding just to get to the country you were going to hunt. Then you do your hunt, and of course, that many more days out, so it was tough. And they didn't have all this fancy gear like we got nowadays. You know, your supplies consisted of sow belly, a big slab of bacon, dried beans, a bag of flour, and a bag of salt. And that was it. You pretty much lived off the land. And think about that next time you're camping on a backpack trip and you pull out your Mountain House gourmet Italian dinner and all your trimmings and stuff, because things were a lot tougher back in those days. So anyhow, they're back in that country. And he was by himself in a spike camp, and he had a big, heavy-set American in there hunting sheep. And the guy died one night in his sleep. Now, you know, Billy was an uneducated blood Indian, grew up in the bush there in British Columbia, and he didn't know about autopsies or anything, and he was just worried sick they'd think he killed this big old fat American. So he didn't know what to do, and he was afraid to come out of the mountains. And so he just hung out for another week or two until he started running out of food, and winter was coming. And well, by then, that big old fat American had frozen solid. He'd rolled him up in his bedroll when he first knew he was dead, but that guy had froze solid as a bar of ice. And of course, there's no way to load a guy on a pack horse like that. You know, he sticks out 4 feet on either side. So, give you a little background. I've packed this old double-bitted axe for probably 30 years in the mountains for a clearing trail. You know, you're riding along, whether you're on a trail or not, and sometimes there's deadfall, and the only thing you can do, carry this gear on your lead pack horse, and you get off and chop the top logs out of the way so you can get the horses through that country. So anyhow, that's what it come to for Billy. So there's more uses for an old double-bitted axe than just splitting wood or cutting a trail. Billy had to chop that frozen guy in two. And he said he was a big old guy, so he said it took a lot of chopping, and he finally got him split in two just above the hips and wrapped him up in a canvas mani and loaded him on either side of a mule and started out of there. Well, you know, you're riding along 10 hours a day, and them horses heat up, and they get sweaty and a lot of body heat coming off. And I asked him, I said, that guy start thawing out every day as you're traveling? And he said, yeah. He said it'd get pretty drippy times late in the afternoon, and when he get to camp the next night, he done wrap that guy and roll him out in the open and let him freeze back up. And then in the morning, he'd throw his manis around him and get him loaded. And anyhow, I just want to let you know there's more uses for an axe than just clearing trail. Old Billy, he was quite a guy. He told you the story about my Indian friend Billy Takes the Gun having to chop that frozen guy in two to get him packed out of the country up there in British Columbia. And I wanted to tell you how I first met Billy and how he ended up with just one arm. I was working on a little job up near Augusta, Montana, and very rarely did I have weekends off, but I did on that job. And I was fishing on the Blackfoot Reservation every night. And I grew up fishing for trout. My granddad put a fly rod in my hand when I was 5 years old, and that was all I knew. And every night I'd watch this one-armed Indian come out, and he'd take the surgical tubing and make a trot line. He'd stretch it across this bay and walk it out and sink it with weights. And the next night he'd have 40 walleye this big, and I couldn't get a bite. So I finally went over one day to ask him how he was catching those walleye. And Indians are pretty reticent. I've got a lot of friends off the Northern Cheyenne Res and the Crow Reservation, and this was the Blackfoot Res, and they're not real friendly, especially to white people, but I pestered him enough, and he cut a blade of grass and he stabbed it in a hollow stem of grass, stuck it in a night crawler and blew a little air bubble in that worm. And then when his weights had sink to the bottom, those worms would float up above the weed bed about that far, and that's how he started catching walleye. And of course, I started catching walleye after that. And so we got to be friendlier and friendlier, and I knew him several months. And he was horribly disfigured. His whole head, I thought he was a burn victim. His whole head was melted. His ear was down on his neck, and of course he's missing an arm at the shoulder, an eye gouged out, and his jaw was disfigured. And I thought he was a burn victim. And I finally asked him after I got to know him well enough what happened. And this, Indians, he wasn't a real eloquent speaker. This is how he told it to me. He says, "Oh, I had a hunter shot a big grizzly bear, and he went down in the alders. We could see his tracks coming out the other side in the snow. So I walked down in them alders, and as soon as I stepped in the brush, that grizzly had circled around and backtracked, and he jumped up and grabbed me and ripped my arm off." And I'm like, "What? That's all there is to the story?" He says, "No." He says the bear got his head in his mouth and was trying to crush his skull, and his whole scalp just popped off. He said it sounded like a gun going off. And so this bear's chewing him up something terrible, and he's in there with his brother. They were just teenagers guiding a hunter. His brother finally shot the bear and killed it off him. And, here they are 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks riding into that backcountry, and he's horribly mauled, and his brother's trying to stop the bleeding, and his arm's just hanging by a little meat here on the shoulder, and he just cut the arm off, and I don't know how he stopped the bleeding, and then tried to get his scalp back on, and he punched holes in that scalp with a pocket knife, and then he pulled tail hairs out of a horse and other holes in the attached scalp and laced that scalp back on him. And, well, they knew old Billy wouldn't make 3 weeks out of that country getting back to civilization, so they decided to go over the coastal mountains and down to saltwater and hoping they'd find a boat. And I've fished up in that country in British Columbia around Campbell River, and those mountains come out of that salt water and go straight up for thousands of feet, and the woods are thick, and there's bears everywhere, and it's not horse-friendly country, but they knew he'd never survive the 2 weeks out, so they went over them mountains, and they lucked out. 3 days of hard travel, and here come the mail boat. And they got old Billy on the boat and took him to Seattle eventually, and he spent half a year in the hospital. And he said it took half his stamina, and I can imagine, but he was a tough old guy. He had married a Blackfoot woman. That's how he ended up down in Montana when I met him. But them old boys were tough. We like to think we're pretty tough and pretty adventurous, but we're a bunch of damn Nancy boys compared to them old timers.